I think you have to dissociate people's behavior with God. Because just because it's recorded in the Bible doesn't mean that God condoned the behavior. And we tend to think, because if it's in the Bible, it must be a true reflection of God, where it might just be a true reflection of the state of the person was in. So Elisha was angry at being teased, and with the authority he had as a prophet, used that authority, in my perspective, inappropriately. But that's just the literal interpretation of the story. There's also allegorical perspectives of the story that you could say that if something is persecuting us, afflicting us as a spiritual dynamic, then we shouldn't be passive about it. So there could be other ways to look at the story, which has a better reflection to it. When it comes to Ananias and Sapphira, when you look at the dynamic of what happened, the implication there is, and what we've probably been taught from an evangelical perspective, is God killed them. But actually, when you go and look it deeper into the story and you actually look at what was said, what Peter did was out of anger. It was not good what he did. He cursed them. You know, it's like with that, because Peter did it, we think that must have been what God wanted him to do. But I don't believe it was. I believe he was angry with them. Now, what happened? What they did opened them up to the consequences of that curse being fulfilled on them. Because each of them had an opportunity of coming clean and admitting that their motive and desire was not correct, but they lied. And Peter was angry what they lied, probably because he didn't want them to be a bad example to the church and all the other things. And what he did was out of his own understanding to deal with the problem. That doesn't mean that that was God's solution to the problem. Mercy would be God's solution to the problem, not I'm going to kill you. Because if God killed them, he's a hypocrite. Because he said to us, do not kill. So that doesn't compute. So God didn't kill them. But they opened themselves up to consequences. And when you look at the terminology used, you don't see God speak into the story at all. It doesn't say Peter prayed, asked God what to do, and then killed them or pronounced them dead. But it was what happened with Peter and their unwillingness to come into the light brought them the result of their darkness effectively upon them. So they reaped what they sowed, but Peter could have offered them mercy and helped them not to suffer the consequences of what they sowed, because God didn't kill them. But the enemy's only too happy to take life. What does he do? Rob, kill, and destroy. So if you give him an opportunity by sowing something that opens you up to the consequences of what you sowed, he'll take it if he can. So that view, in a new covenant, it isn't an expression of God within the new covenant that he's going around killing people, because that would be so hypocritical, and God is not a hypocrite. But people can suffer the consequences, and some sickness is a consequence of people's unforgiveness or other things that gives the enemy the opportunity to torture them physically, emotionally, spiritually, because they're in a torture chamber. So there are consequences of stuff. Now, when you look at the story from a different perspective, then you get a different result of what happened and why it happened, and God really wasn't anything to do with it and wasn't even included in it. Well, it's not that Peter took their life, but he didn't offer them life. He didn't offer them forgiveness and a way out. There's nowhere there in there. Peter chose to forgive them and bless them, which is what Jesus told his disciples to do with those who seemingly are your enemies. There was none of that in the story. So Peter was operating, because Peter tended to be somewhat rash and somewhat operating out of different things. You could say anger. You know, Peter was also motivated by the need to be approved by others, hence why he wouldn't eat with the Gentiles when they came, because people from Jerusalem were coming and he didn't want to be associated with Gentiles because of the Jews. Well, that's all sort of character flaws that are all in there, which are exposed. You know, Peter and Paul had an argument over it, and Paul called him out and effectively called him a hypocrite for what he was doing. So just because Peter was, you know, one of the lead apostles, if you like, doesn't mean that he was perfect or what he did was perfect. Now, what I believe Peter should have done, once they were caught out in what they were doing, was ask them, forgave them, chose to forgive them, and want to bless them and restore them. But he didn't. So he left them at the mercy of them reaping what they were sowing, and that was not a good thing. He could have given them mercy, which removed the sowing from what reaping from what they sowed, if he'd chosen to forgive them and bless them, but he didn't. So I don't think it's a very good example of what we should be doing, or how we should treat people who are caught in some sort of wrong activity, belief, or behavior. You know, is that we don't want to be stoning people. That was the equivalent of Peter stoning them in reality. And it was not a good thing. He was stoning them with his words by not offering them mercy. Jesus did not do that. He could have done exactly the same that Jesus did with the woman caught in adultery. And he could have said, hey, go and sin no more. He could have forgiven them and given them that opportunity to embrace walking a different way, but he didn't give them that opportunity. Should have been a process of restoration, not you know. And again, later on, there you see things happen when people refuse to accept. Peter was very different to Paul, and Paul encouraged them to offer mercy. And if the person refused the mercy, refused to acknowledge whatever and receive it, then you allow them to suffer the consequences of what there is, but with the motivation that they would be brought back into the fold. He called it handing them over to the enemy. But really what he was doing was, he says, live in the cold and then want to come back in the warm, not I want you killed. So there was a difference to how they approached things. Because I think Paul had a revelation of Jesus that Peter didn't have, but he should have done. I mean, did not Peter 3 times reject Jesus? And then what did Jesus do? 3 times gives him the opportunity of embracing Jesus. That's not what he gave to Ananias and Sapphira. So he wasn't releasing that which he'd received, because he could have suffered the consequences of what he did, but Jesus forgave him and restored him and brought him into the position within the church of influence and government.